Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Stuart Brodsky, Professor of Sustainability at the Schack Institute of Real Estate at the School of Professional Studies of NYU. And I am pleased to have you here today to listen to our discussion about ESG, environmental social governance, and its emergence as a point of conversation. Well, not just a point of conversation, but as a requirement and a area of required demonstration of performance in the real estate industry. I'm going to be joined today by Christopher Cayten of CodeGreen, which is a leading ESG and sustainability consulting firm with offices in New York and San Francisco. And Chris has participated in panels that we've had in the past on a variety of topics and is a great, I don't want to say just student of the industry, but advisor and supporter of the industry, and has great insight into the emergence of this issue as one that the real estate industry is being called upon to pay attention to. So welcome, Chris.
Great, thank you. Glad to be here. I may turn off my video during the beginning of your presentation, but I will definitely be watching and excited to contribute.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. So let me move this to presentation mode, the rise of ESG in real estate. I'm going to provide a little bit of background on sustainability in the real estate industry, in the real estate world, as context for this conversation, and then talk about the roots of ESG in the philosophy, the social philosophical social philosophy of in terms of the social contract as just background, kind of intellectual background. Not that I'm an expert in the area, but I do find it interesting. And then I'll review some aspects of the relationship between the social contract and the rise of ESG's adoption as an investor requirement. I'll refer to and we'll look at a couple of quick examples of how the real estate industry is talking about ESG and reporting on it, and then open up with Chris into a conversation about, well, among other things, particular programs that he sees as being the ones that the real estate industry is engaging in, and how he sees the conversation, his conversation with his clients evolving to address the issues of ESG, and where he sees the management of the process of addressing the ESG going. So background on, and this is a focus a little bit on my own work, background, ESG, the E stands for environmental, the S is G, S is social, and the G is governance, and ESG is an area of criteria and evaluation of the performance of companies, where 10 years ago, 5 years ago, we focused on the E, on the environment. And ESG is now kind of has been combined and is called upon by companies to demonstrate something called their corporate social responsibility, sometimes referred to as CSR. But within the context of CSR and ESG, the focus of my work and the focus of the Center for the Sustainable Built Environment, of which I'm the director at Schack, is on the E part, and in particular on the relationship between buildings and carbon emissions, which are part of or associated with our greatest environmental threat, global warming. And as you can see by this chart from the World Green Building Council, buildings, whether it's through the operation of buildings or the manufacturing of the building materials that go into our buildings, represent nearly 40% of global, or 39% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And this is more than the total of other industrial sectors and more across the globe than transportation. So when we think about addressing our environmental challenge, I like to remember that while a lot of us think, well, we need to drive our cars to be more energy efficient and we need to throw away less plastic into the ocean, and we do need to do those things. And we are doing better at that. And we are also doing better at building operations and energy embodied in the manufacture of building materials. But buildings are the greatest chunk of the pie, the greatest slice of the pie. And it is where we focus. And one of the questions I have to Chris, as well as to in the conversation, is advancing our progress in addressing the E by combining it with the S and the G, just as in the past 2 decades with the rise of the green building certification programs, we have combined our concern and interest for the operational energy and the operational greenhouse gas emissions associated with buildings with many other environmental aspects associated with buildings. And I have this question as to whether or not we have advanced our conversation on operational energy and operational greenhouse gas emissions more because we've combined it with these other issues, or would it be more efficient if we separated these conversations and had different programs and different metrics of performance associated with these different issues? And it's not a question I think we can easily answer, but I think it's a question we can keep in mind. So the roots of today's ESG, going back to something called social contract theory, the theory of social contract, which really has roots in ancient Greek philosophy, but was elaborated upon during the Enlightenment, starting perhaps most with Hobbes Thomas Hobbes in the 16th century. This has been a conversation about whether or not the individual has rights that supersede that of the community. And this conversation or question has been posited or posed in a variety of different forms, including the conversation presented in this cartoon with Thomas Hobbes, that freedom of the individual is good. But if freedom of the individual threatens the individual's security because of the instability of the community in which the individual exists, then maybe it's better for the individual to sacrifice some of their freedoms and rights in exchange for stability in the community. So an individual's behavior and treatment of others relates to an agreement that he or she has with every other individual within a society. And the idea is, the question is, are we more secure as individuals when we acknowledge and accept the rights and the responsibilities of understanding the rights of others? So I think that in terms of in the direction of ESG, there's been an evolution in this conversation about social contract theory. And it's been one that where the conversation has shifted from the idea of doing no harm to others in order to secure your own interests to the idea or the question as to whether or not I am my brother's keeper. And therefore, is the well-being of my neighbor, my brother, my sister, better served by my support of them, not to mention just my respect for them as individuals. Particularly when there are conditions of wealth and abundance as I see it, which is where we live today in most of the developed world. The question, I think, has been extended. And the question includes, does providing support for your neighbor contribute to your own well-being? And by further evolution, does looking out for the well-being of your neighbor who you might consider to be your customer, because so many of our relationships are customer and client related, does the looking out for the well-being of your customer and client strengthen your customer-provider relationship. And in the context of business, this is where ESG currently resides. The idea that if we treat our customers better, customers will be more sticky, they'll come back to us, they will be able to afford to buy our products and services more easily, and everyone will therefore presumably benefit. Some of the discussion of the contract theory can be seen in the roots of planned communities, which I think is interesting intersection with real estate development. And some of this, again, goes back to historic roots such as monasticism and the Protestant Reformation, and is embodied in the idea of Christian communities and utopias, but also, I think, came to rise in the 18th and 19th century with the mass industrialization of towns, and the observation that the quality of living of those people who lived in towns, who worked in our factories, might not have been particularly salubrious, to say the least. That's not the right word. Have been particularly, there had been not a lot of equity and fairness, and company towns hope to address some of the issues of fairness and provide workers with a standard of living that not only brought them perhaps greater happiness, but also made them more productive individuals because they were healthier and happier as individuals in a town. So the Industrial Revolution is a period of time where, among other things, we saw among some industrialists an increasing awareness of the plight of the worker and emergence of planned, although not necessarily utopian communities, sponsored by large employers, where the communities provided social services, including the wellness of workers, as well as the proximity of workers to their sites of work, which therefore created greater value, made the workers a greater valued resource that could be optimized, resulting in superior efficiency and superior returns, for superior productivity for the factory and for the factory owner. This extends, I think, in the efficiency wage theory, which is something that I don't know if Henry Ford described it as the efficiency wage theory, but in 1914 he initiated a policy where he doubled the wage of the employees in his factories, thinking that because the conditions were not always great, and certainly people were not always stimulated and physically burdened, and might have been physically burdened or otherwise not engaged, at least if we paid them more, I think Henry's logic was, they would be happier. And if they were happier, they would be more productive. There would be less turnover and less absence. And also, according to the labor economist Harley Cayten, an outcome of efficiency, of the application of efficiency wage theory, was the creation of a consumer class, a bigger class of people who could afford to buy the mass-produced products that were being manufactured in these factories. So efficiency wage was serving multiple interests, and in serving the interests of the producer, of the owner of the capital, in multiple ways, while at the same time incrementally improving the outlook and the life of the individual worker. So we go from there to thinking about the idea that attending to the customer's interests is in the interests of the holders of the capital. And we can see this as having parallels in the earlier conversation about the social contract. I think there's a direct relationship. Now, how does this apply to ESG? Well, ESG is a conversation from largely stimulated by investors, saying that if companies that the investors put their money in would serve the interests of customers better, then investors would in turn profit. Particularly, this is the case when the investors are institutional investors such as pension funds and sovereign wealth funds and labor union pension funds that have a mandate and for a fiduciary relationship with the average worker, with the middle class. So investor activism, which we can also just call self-conscious investing, is the idea that if we are investing in a company that treats its workers poorly, are we guilty by implication of accepting and approving of the policies and practices of the company? In other words, do unjust practices on the part of a corporation imply investor approval? And if your investor is a pension fund, a labor union pension fund, a sovereign wealth fund, a public employee retirement system, it goes against your interest as an investor to generate income to support the retirement of your annuitants at the expense of other aspects of the quality of life of your annuitants. Some investor activism that has been most robustly remarked upon is the investor activism in the 1980s against the apartheid regime. And investors were saying that they would boycott or withdraw investment from companies that were beneficiaries of business activities in South Africa, which was in an apartheid environment with rampant and institutional racism. And the question is, again, is the investor complicit in approval of these conditions by reaping the rewards from the profits of companies that engage in business practices that result in diminution of the rights of the individuals? And conversely, does investment in companies that support and improve the quality of life of the individuals in a community represent a more productive and more egalitarian form of investing? I've referenced the idea that pension funds, particularly labor union pension funds and public employee retirement systems, have been increasingly conversant in this, as have sovereign wealth funds, particularly those that whose nations stand by the rights of workers in a robust way, or stand by an issue such as the global climate change issue by signing the Paris Climate Accord. So sovereign wealth funds of countries that have been very active and proactive in response to the Paris Climate Accord are investing with a screen toward environmental risk and environmental opportunity. Lastly, there is a term called impact investing, and there was this book written by Judith Rodin, former president of Rockefeller Foundation, which is a $4 or $5 billion foundation, called The Power of Impact Investing, where Rodin and others have recognized that through grants and investments, not just grants, but also investments, you can support companies that make a difference within their communities. And you can screen investments and exclude yourself from investing or in companies or writing grants for companies that do poorly in their relationship to serving the greater interests of the communities in which they operate. At the United Nations, or through the United Nations, a group of investor stakeholders convened the Forum for the Principles for Responsible Investment. And they define ESG as environmental, social, and governance, where environmental looks at climate change, resource depletion, waste, pollution, and deforestation at a minimum. Social, as addressing human rights, modern slavery, child labor, working conditions, and employee relations. And governance, addressing issues of bribery and corruption, executive pay, board diversity and structure, political lobbying and donations, and tax strategy. tax avoidance in particular. So the institutional investors convened through the United Nations for PRI defines responsible investment as a strategy and practice to incorporate environmental, social, and governance factors in investment decisions and active ownership, where those environmental, social, and governance factors contribute to the greater being of the broader community. In real estate, and the PRI does have a real estate focus, there is the case they cite that there is a solid investment case for incorporating ESG factors. A competitive and well-established regulation have encouraged real estate investors to implement some of the most comprehensive approaches to responsible investment. Nevertheless, the PRI warns in their real estate literature that ESG factors such as climate risk and fragmented sustainability standards still pose challenges to responsible investment in real estate. So, in other words, we're having this conversation, presumably we're having the conversation in the right place with the idea of the community and the customer in mind, and the long-term benefit of all, but there are still a lack of standard metrics by which to evaluate companies, and therefore metrics upon which you might make, a lack of metrics upon which you might make investment decisions. In real estate, this conversation has been taken up. Among others, the National Association of Real Estate Investment Trusts has launched an annual ESG report, and that is on top of the pre-existing Leader in the Light Award, which was an environmental program that I actually first wrote 20 years ago now. But the ESG program recognizes and embraces the idea of environmental stewardship among its REITs, and the ESG report claims that nearly 100% of the industry is investing in energy savings, waste mitigation, sustainable building materials, and responsible environmental management. From a social responsibility perspective, the report claims that this has been a long-term focus of its members, and that partnerships between its members and their communities are addressing customer needs, engage employees, and promote community well-being. Further, the report says that good governance is a cross-functional, is represented by cross-functional ESG teams, discussions about executive compensation policies, and diversity and inclusion. So this report highlights and features the work of many different REITs that stand out in all of these ways. Vornado, a very large real estate investment trust that most of us are probably familiar with, based here in New York, issues an outstanding ESG report, which describes sustainability it says that sustainability is more broadly defined or referred to as ESG. And what I found interesting about this report, which is full of great information, or rather information about admirable steps, very admirable and quantifiable steps that the company has taken to address environmental issues. 20 pages of the report, by my read, address environmental issues, environmental topics, not excluding wellness. And then there are other sections that address tenant and community development, security, diversity, social impacts, volunteering of employees, and supply chain diversity. And my feeling is that the S and the G, somewhere between the NAREIT report and the Vornado report, you can get a sense of the S and the G are not quite as robust or robustly defined, and that perhaps the path and the metrics for reporting on S and G aren't as mature as they are for the E. Now, recently, BlackRock committed to ESG investing. And in 2020, the CEO's letter to investors said that they would be rolling out robust programs for screening of the companies that they invest in for ESG criteria, remembering that BlackRock has $2.7 trillion in assets under management. This sounds like a very bold stroke because it is such a large organization. And since 2020, they have reported that they've integrated ESG investing policies across all asset classes. They have allocated $23 billion specifically to ESG investments, which doesn't sound like a lot compared to the $2.7 trillion they have under management, but it was just under 1 year that they did it. And that the $23 billion was a multiple over the prior year's investment of $450 million. So clearly there is robust action occurring, even if it is not yet fully rolled out across all $2.7 trillion in assets. The company exits investments in BlackRock exits investments in companies where over 25% of the revenue is from coal, thermal coal. And they have launched the Aladdin climate standards for assessing climate risk. And they have over 1,200 climate metrics added to their ESG data performance. So again, lots of work. A lot of it seems to be focused on the E, at least that which I pulled out. And the question remains, why is the S and the G there? And is it helping? Is E leading and bringing S and G along? What is the relationship, I think is worth asking, and what is the path forward for combining these three types of attributes and concerns? In real estate practice, we see a variety of companies that are doing some outstanding work. Jonathan Rowe's companies, not far physically from us on 42nd Street and Fifth Avenue, their headquarters. Jonathan Rowe's recently closed an impact acquisition fund with investors focused on climate change, poverty, and income inequality and COVID health concerns. And this is a fund, closed fund of $525 million. And it is not Jonathan Rowe's company's first fund in this direction, I believe. But they do stand out among companies that have been able to do this. And Jonathan says that our fundraising was a testament to the rising interest of investors in impact and our team's track record over the last decade and a half of delivering on that promise. And he further says that every one of our investors underwrote our environmental and social track records as deeply as they did our financial track record. And to me, that's an important point, obviously, because a lot of people assume that addressing E or E, S, and G issues comes at a cost premium where there is a potential diminution in returns. And he is saying that there is no sacrifice in financial returns, that the financial returns are robust at the same time as the ESG strategies return to the community. So with all of that in mind, and a lot more going on than this, but this was meant to provide an overview, I invite us to consider how appropriate it is for the aggregation of these three sets of issues. How meaningful are the claims, whether they're environmental or otherwise, relative to the acknowledged challenges that we have, whether it's in diversity and in equity and inclusion, or in governance. I also question where we stand today, just as just to understand how much more work we have to do. How pervasive is the adoption? And how do these practices contribute to the profits and returns of real estate owners and customers? In particular, what is the impact or stickiness of the ESG on communities and the public, including tenants? And how do investors provide greater access to capital and at better terms because of the ESG practices of the companies that they invest in? So those are the ideas that I encourage us all to think through further, and not just leave as a static condition. And I invite Chris to comment on what I presented from whatever angle you care to, and also because you are a practitioner serving many customers or clients who are pursuing ESG strategies. How do you feel the work is going? How has it evolved? And how do you see it evolving further to iron out any wrinkles that you see existing?
Wow, well, that was insightful and thorough, and an impressive, I think, a great grounding of how we have gotten to where we are. You know, right. So first of all, I'm Chris Cayten. I'm a partner and senior director at CodeGreen Solutions. We're a sustainability and energy management now. I'd say as of 3 years ago, ESG consultant. Used to be considered a sustainability consultant based in New York. We really focus our work on existing commercial real estate. So we're not building brand new buildings. We're not building those shiny new buildings. We're helping real estate owners and investors and operators improve the sustainability of their properties. And even so, the terminology, I think, is, you could have a whole semester on the terminology in this area, right? I think your core question around, do ESG make sense together, I think is a very valid question. I can tell you from the now 12, 13 years I've been working on sustainability in real estate, the definition of sustainable real estate and the perceived value of sustainability in real estate have evolved. I kind of joke with my colleagues that every 2 years, there's a new topic that's added into sustainable real estate. So 12 years ago, it was only LEED. If you had a green building, it was because you achieved LEED certification. And LEED included energy efficiency. It also included some materials, and it also included a little bit of air quality and health and well-being. It was trying to, really group a number of things together. What we've seen is every few years, new topics get added to this. So I'd say health and well-being was added maybe 5 or 6 years ago. Climate risk and resilience was added maybe 4 years ago. And ESG, which really came from the investment world. ESG was not something that was native to real estate. That came into real estate really from a top down, from investors who were using ESG across all asset classes to evaluate companies. So my personal opinion is that ESG is really the entire health of a company, right? I mean, if there's any alpha, any benefit, or any problem or any risk identified, you can tie them back to any aspect of the E, the S, or the G, right? If the CEO is a crook, that's the G. If they don't pay their staff well and everyone leaves, that's the S. If they, are dumping toxic chemicals, into a river, that's the E. All of those things are ESG. So to me, I would agree with your statement, which is or I would take one angle on your statement, which I do believe ESG is too broad a topic to be considered in just one piece of an evaluation of an organization. That ESG essentially is the entire organization. It's the health. It is the barometer of the health of the whole. There's nothing that's not covered within ESG from my perspective. So I think we are, as an industry, as I mentioned, all of those aspects were kind of glommed on to sustainability, wellness, risk resilience, ESG. All these pieces were glommed on to sustainability, and the professionals in the industry, both within these organizations. So if you were the head of sustainability in a real estate company 10 years ago, all you knew was LEED. And if you were a consulting firm, all you knew was LEED. 5 years later, they said, oh, you understand, these touchy-feely, feel-good aspects of real estate. Why don't you deal with health and well-being? So now you had to go learn a bunch of metrics around health and well-being. Climate risk and resilience got added on as well. That's a whole nother industry, understanding floodplains and heat stress prone, properties. and even the physical interventions one would need to do in order to defend against those things. But that again was added on. So now we had heads of sustainability who were now green building, wellness, climate risk experts. And now ESG is added on, which, as you've mentioned a number of times, the S and the G are a whole nother field of expertise that typically the heads of sustainability at real estate firms, most of them were grounded in engineering, grounded in architecture. They were looking at the physical impacts of these buildings on the environment. Having them become the head of ESG, which includes the S and the G, in my mind is way outside of their comfort zone, way outside of their expertise, where the S and the G, the S may be, community relations, it may be other aspects of an organization. The G, goes all the way to the top and the board. I mean, the person who's in charge of the G is the board and the CEO. You don't have some mid-level head of sustainability who's now in charge of the G. And so I do think that, as you again mentioned, the reference to the S and the G in reports and analysis is a much younger field. It is a much younger topic. So the relative space dedicated to S and G in these ESG reports is typically less than on the E, where again the rooting of ESG in real estate, at least, maybe not true for if you manufacture T-shirts in Indonesia or other things. ESG means a very different thing to you, but for real estate, ESG really came out of the sustainability initiatives. So there was a longer history of information, both case studies and wins and initiatives on the E than there is the S and the G. So it's a long answer to that point, but I do think the S and the G are much newer. I'm not sure how long these professionals who are rooted in merely sustainability, which is already a big enough topic, are going to be able to really lead and innovate and manage what's going to be required for the S and the G in these large organizations. That's going to require input from HR, going to require input from other groups that these heads of sustainability. I think you're seeing a number of folks who last year their title was head of sustainability at a real estate firm. This year their title is head of ESG. Yes. That may get bifurcated again as they realize, just like in any industry, when something's new, you think you can do you can do it all, and then it gets split into very specific subsets, and then those grow up to be their own set of challenges that need to be managed very, very specifically and can't be done under a larger umbrella.
Yeah, so you see, that's interesting. So you see this evolution where there's an aggregation of a relatively new topic, and they add on two other new topics as perhaps a natural progression, and that it could disaggregate as well, also part of a natural progression, perhaps not unlike other practices across the histories of the organization of corporations have evolved. And this is not, therefore, nothing particularly new, but just part of a process.
Exactly. I think, again, even back to sustainability, we do a lot of work with certifications at the asset level. So, 10, 12 years, 15 years ago, LEED was really the only certification people talked about. And they did try to get a little bit of materials. They did try to get a little bit of air quality. They did try to get a little bit of, energy efficiency. Then years later, you have entirely new certifications pop up like Well and Fitwell that say, you are only really scratching the surface on wellness within LEED. Here's a whole specific certification just on wellness. Mm-hmm. You have now a whole specific certification just on air quality, the reset certification. It's just air quality. It's this tiny sliver. So that natural separation and sort of specificity, I think, will come to ESG. Right now, it's a very big umbrella.
Interesting. Also interesting, a comment you made earlier about how, if you think about it, between E and SG, you're really characterizing all aspects of a company.
Yeah, what's not under one of those? Right?
Well, what's not under one of those is financial returns. And
Is that not the G? Is that not the?
I don't know if G is just governance, as in the appropriateness of the behavior, and the diversity of and equity and inclusion of the leadership. And I'm not going to fall my sword over it, but it makes you wonder if organizations like BlackRock have now hundreds of metrics that are ESG related. What does that do to the metrics that they were looking at before?
Right. Well, I remember, this is not my specific area of expertise, but I do remember there is a lot of talk around which new metrics do you need, and which new metrics, I can't recall the term, do not correlate to other metrics, therefore you don't need them.
Right.
And I do know, and they've actually stopped talking about this term non-financial reporting, right? That always used to be, and so to your point, maybe the grouping that ESG has become really was everything else that was non-financial. So just as you stated, the one thing that's not within ESG is a financial. So they say there's financial, what we used to call non-financial reporting. They've literally put every aspect of non-financial reporting under this bucket.
Yeah. Well, so we've gotten a lot more specific because non-financial was so broad, and at least now we understand the three major categories of non-financial, and that articulating that allows us to go a very long way in addressing those challenges.
Yeah, but I would also add a point that you brought up, which is very true, is the question around metrics and standards for measuring ESG. I think the standards for measuring the E are longer standing. There's a longer tradition, especially in real estate. Things like energy use and their direct calculation into carbon emissions are super easy and super clear, right? That's something that's we're blessed in real estate to be able to calculate our carbon emissions, at least from operating buildings, pretty easily. So I'd say that those metrics are pretty well established. Establishing metrics for S and G, there's a long way to go, both for real estate firms and non-real estate firms, in terms of what are those metrics, what is good, what is bad, and how do you standardize those, at least within industries, real estate, and what those represent versus other industries.
Right. Well, while you were on your discussion of carbon metrics, I wanted to pull in a question that one of the participants in the panel posed, and I do encourage others to ask questions through the Q&A. But the question was, do you think that the climate risk in real estate will continue to be a large problem for achieving least environmental impact? Is it possible for ESG standards due to the sheer emissions factor of concrete? And the context for this question, as I tell my students, is that if concrete were its own country, it would be the third largest emitter of carbon dioxide emissions in the world. The manufacture of concrete has tremendous environmental impacts, specifically related to carbon dioxide emissions from the energy as well as the curing process. And my answer to the question is that there is some exciting work going on in terms of new formulations of concrete that are showing tremendous promise. And there's also a movement toward the use of cross-laminated timber and cross-laminated timber and mass timber construction, which embodies or embeds carbon in a highly efficient, structurally building material that sequesters carbon. So I think we're on the precipice or on the dawning of a new age of construction, and keeping in mind that most places don't build buildings regularly that are 60 stories high. Most places build buildings regularly that are 3 and 4 stories high. And so even as inconceivable as some of us think that it is, although we're wrong, that you can't have high-rise timber buildings, you can. But in most cases, we don't call for high-rise buildings. Most cases, we call for 3 and 4 story buildings, and the majority of the square footage across the country and across the world is going to be in buildings under 30 stories. And that wood, mass timber, is a appropriate and elegant and very modern, and I mean that in most contemporary way, solution to our environmental challenge that is posed to us by concrete.
No, well said. Yeah, I think right, we do spend most of our time, or at least, the operating real estate firms that I work with spend most of their time concerned with the operational emissions from their, again, in terms of maturity of industries, I would say, right, the discussion of operational emissions and the carbon footprint and impact on the environment of existing buildings has had a longer history over, say, the last decade or more than a more recent push to really talk about, what they call embedded carbon, the carbon footprint of constructing the buildings. So there are some standards that are being developed around how to quantify the carbon emissions that are associated with constructing new buildings. And I would say those are not as widely adopted as green building initiatives around existing buildings and the climate impacts of existing buildings. But that is definitely an area of growth in terms of holding real estate firms and architects and engineers and builders accountable for the emissions of new buildings.
And it's a serious area, even though it represents 10%, 11% of global emissions. The fact of the matter is, according to some resources, the development needs across the world, due to rising population and increasing wealth that is bringing out of poverty hundreds of millions and billions of people who don't already have access to a quality built environment. The trajectory for new construction is equivalent to building, let me see if I have the numbers right, one New York City every 35 days for the next 35 years.
Right.
So I, as your practice reflects, have traditionally been very focused on the operational energy in buildings, but it is not the only place. But of course, every new building is tomorrow's old building, which has embodied and embedded carbon in it, and still a question of the ongoing energy efficiency.
And also, I would point out that as buildings do approach operational net zero, which is very real, and there are many buildings targeting it, either with on-site or off-site renewable energy and other interventions, as the operational emissions, gets towards zero, the overall carbon footprint of that building becomes overwhelmingly tilted towards the embedded carbon of constructing it. So, once you've gotten rid of all the operational emissions, right now you're saying it's 10%, or it's maybe, I think, traditionally 30% or so of a brand new office building that's, say, going to last 50 years. Now it becomes 90% of the carbon emissions of the building's life because the operational has dropped so low.
Yes, and from an engineering and architecture perspective, if you get geeky about this, if you get excited about this geeky kind of thing, which I do, we are, again, as I said before, on the precipice, on the edge of a phenomenal revolution, I think, in the way we build our buildings and the ratio, as you just described, between embodied and recurring carbon. Nevertheless, I wonder if anyone else has any questions.
I do want to spend, I know you started with, I do want to spend a little bit of time on the sort of the investor side of ESG, just since you had picked up on that a little bit, throughout, in terms of, Larry Fink's letter and other aspects of that essentially, why are real estate investors, why are pension funds focusing on ESG? I think you touched on it a little bit, but it's really, there are two sides to it, right? There are everybody who's building buildings, everybody who's investing money, you're always investing somebody else's money. And realistically, most of the industry all trickles back down to pensioners and folks who have their money in their long-term retirement. They want to know what their money is going to be spent on. Just like you said, are they associated with the businesses that their money goes to support and goes to build? So those pension funds have been really the first movers for pushing sustainability at first, and now ESG, really all the way down from the top through the real estate industry. So those pension funds who say, look, we're being held accountable by our teachers, our firefighters, our public servants, It's those mom and pop folks who want to know, what is my money going into. That starts the process, and that starts the ball rolling. So they are really, I would say, the real estate industry in the last year or two, and I've written a little bit about this. The real estate industry in the last year or two has really shifted from this idea of developers building green buildings to attract tenants and put a flashy label on the building for their neighbors, to really pushing sustainability through their whole organization to attract investors. So I think that, that's going to shift a little bit in terms of, where real estate firms are spending their money with regards to sustainability, whether or not they're putting these shiny trophies on the building, or are they actually kind of doing their homework and looking inward and saying, look, we gotta get our ESG programs and policies and internal accountability tightened up. So when we go to pitch to an investor, we go to pitch to a pension fund to say, hey, you should really trust us with your money. We can say, look, this is everything we're doing for sustainability. This is everything we're doing for ESG. And that's a big shift, because the last 10 years, most of the market was driven by the marketing, or most of the impetus for sustainability was driven by that trophy building with a big green plaque on it saying, I'm the greenest building, you should come work here. That may be shifting from, at least from the institutional real estate that we work a lot with.
Right. Interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I'd like to see that piece of writing. Maybe you should guest lecture on it someday. I'd like to address one other question here, but before I do, encourage those who are on the call to keep an eye out. We will have another call later in the semester. I apologize that I don't remember the date, where we look at ESG issues again, and I will have some of the leaders from within the real estate companies, perhaps some that we mentioned earlier, talking about their ESG work. But there was a participant who had a question from the audience regarding the accessibility of ESG funding for workforce housing, if I interpreted the question right. And I think that the Jonathan Rose example is exactly an example of that, where $500 million in impact investment fund, and his intention is, and I know he's developing and continuing to build workforce housing. So it is definitely part of the conversation of impact investing, is not just building more sustainable buildings, but building them for people who are underserved in their market.
Yeah, there are. I think one of the pieces around ESG investing is the question that Jonathan Rose clearly points to is, are you getting investors who say, oh, I want to do this because it's going to make me feel good and rest easy, but I might have to give up some returns. That's really not the case anymore. Right now, they're saying this is the right thing to do. This is going to, you're going to build a superior product. You're going to get superior income. You're going to have superior asset values, which are going to give positive returns to them and their investors, and their own pensioners that they're serving. So that story is pretty much over. This idea that, well, in order to get these things, you have to sacrifice something financially.
Well, it's over if you know the secret sauce. I mean, Jonathan is still one of the very few number of people who knows how to do this. It would seem.
Right.
He's still a leader and an innovator, and he doesn't have a lot of company. As far as I can tell.
That is true.
Yeah. So anyway, we're almost at the bottom of the hour, and Chris Cayten from CodeGreen, I want to thank you again, and I want to thank the 50 plus people who are on the call today for joining in, and look for other faculty talks every Wednesday afternoon, and one later in the semester that I will host again, where we'll talk further about ESG. And have a great day, everyone. Thank you.